this video, I'll be discussing how to make a front line and why front lines are important, as well as how to construct quality responses on a front line. So let's first talk about what is a front line. How do I use a front line? When should I use a front line? So a front line is really helpful in debate because it's your responsibility as a debater, especially as a second speaker, to respond to your opponent's arguments that they read in their case. This is what a front line helps you with, because a front line is a group of pre-written arguments that are used to respond to the specific case points that people create. So for example, on the universal background checks topic, a common pro point is that universal background checks decrease violence. That's a specific point. You can create a specific front line to respond to this point. So, how do you do that? Well, when you're creating responses on a front line, there is 4 parts that you need within one response. So the first part of that is you need the type of argument you are making. This can consist of something like it's not linking to the argument, there's no warrant as to why this is true, they don't have a strong impact, or we outweigh. The second thing you need to have is you need to have reasoning or some logic as to why this is true. You need to be able to show with warrants, reasoning, why this even makes sense. Third, in addition to that, you need to be able to prove why your warrant or logic or reasoning is true with some evidence. This is either evidence, a study or someone who's an expert in the area said it, but just some quality evidence to prove whatever you're trying to claim is true. Fourth and finally, you need to demonstrate to the judge why this matters. This is probably the most important part of it, and the part that gets left out the most is, why do I care as a judge? Why does it even matter that you just stood up there and said what you just said? You need to emphasize that to the judge, or they won't get it. So I will show you a quick example of this in the context of universal background checks. So this also shows you the formatting that you need. As you can see in the top left-hand corner, you need to have AC debate. That simply means that it's from Aberdeen Central, it's Aberdeen Central's piece of paper if someone were to lose it. Second, and most importantly, you need to have which side you are debating on. So it says you are con. That means you are the con team. This creates clarification and it makes it easier when you have a bunch of papers to sort them out. You don't want your papers getting confused and you end up reading a pro front line when you're actually the con team. And then on the right-hand side, you need to put your name. Right below that, you need to put answer to, that's what AT means, the specific type of argument or name of the argument you're answering. So, for example, in this case, we're answering the pro argument, which is universal background checks will decrease violence. That's a pro point. So we're answering that with this front line, and that's just what we put up there in bold and underlined. Right below that, in italics and parentheses, you need to put a short description of what your opponent is trying to argue with that. So what the argument you're trying to use this front line for. So in this case, since we're arguing or answering universal background checks will decrease violence, we would put the pro is trying to argue implementing universal background checks will decrease violence because it limits access to weapons by people who have a criminal record. So they assume that that means it will decrease violence. All right, right below that, you will have your list of responses, and responses are all numbered. You want to make sure you number your responses. A good amount of responses is anywhere from 3 to 6, and front lines should be anywhere from 125 to 250 words. So let's talk about what this 4-part response looks like. So as you can see, the first part of it is there's a type of argument you will make, as we said. So in this one, we say that there is no impact. That's a type of argument. Saying something doesn't have an impact is a type of argument. So that's the argument we're making with this first response here. But you can't just say that. You have to be able to back it up. So that's where we get the second part of this. And this is kind of explaining why we believe there is no impact. This is the logic I use. So even if a background check is in place, criminals will still be able to obtain guns through the black market. So that kind of proves that there's no impact. And I'm kind of leading into this argument. But even that will need further evidence. So that's where we get our third part, which we say is you need evidence to support your argument. So this piece of evidence was from James Jacobs. And what he says is that criminals will still be able to purchase guns. Inmates were still able to purchase weapons from the black market, so it proves that criminals can still purchase these regardless of universal background checks. And then finally, and most importantly, we have this last line here, which is, why does this argument matter? So we show to the judge that if you implement universal background checks, but criminals can still obtain guns through the black market, it shows that violence won't actually be decreased because these people will still be able to obtain guns illegally. Thus, the point is kind of a wash because it doesn't really do anything. There's no positive impact on violence if you implement universal background checks. So that's the point you have to emphasize to the judge. Why does this argument matter?